everyone. Welcome to another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. It's a very special edition today because, clean this camera off here. It's a very special edition today because it is May 4th, and that means it is Star Wars Day. So I and my special guest, Baby Yoda, would like to wish all of you a very happy Star Wars Day, and May the 4th be with you. In honor of that, we are going to be reading a special book called BB-8 on the Run by the author of The Day the Crayons Quit, Drew Daywalt. I also have that book. It just arrived, so I will be reading that sometime this week. So I have a little bit of a complicated setup here. I'm going to be showing you the ebook on my laptop, so hopefully you can see the images. And then I will be reading, you don't want to read that. That's just work stuff. And then I will be reading from my tablet over here. So if it looks like I'm not looking at the camera, that is why. So our book is called Star Wars BB-8 on the Run, written by Drew Daywalt, illustrated by Matt Myers. And hopefully y'all can see the illustrations okay. BB-8 wasn't used to being on his own, and it was scary, very scary. His friend Poe had told him to run. "Get as far away from here as you can," the pilot had said. "I'll come back for you." But BB-8 had seen the explosion back in Tuanul village, and he feared Poe was gone. Now it was all up to him to get the top-secret map to the Resistance so they could find Luke Skywalker. All up to him. That was scary too. As he took shelter for the night, BB-8 remembered something else Poe had said once to him. "It's easy, buddy. You do good things, and good things will come back to you." But how could such a small droid do such a big job? See, there we go. The next morning, as BB-8 resumed his journey, he was glad to come across someone else. It was Tito, but he was in trouble. His lugabeast was sinking into the sand. "Please help," said Tito in a language that sounded like screeches and warbles. BB-8 was in a hurry to complete his mission, but he felt sorry for Tito and for the lugabeast too. Maybe BB-8 could do something for them. "Oh no, it's a trap! I'm going to take you apart and sell you piece by piece," said Tito. "You're even more valuable than the other one." "What other one?" A panel closed above BB-8, shutting out the sunlight. He realized that the only thing scarier than being alone in the dark was not being alone in the dark. Then the huge shape spoke. "Please don't hurt me," it cried, trembling. It wasn't a monster at all, just a big, gentle loading droid. BB-8 chirped happily at the massive thing. "You promise?" it asked, worried. BB-8 nodded wholeheartedly and beeped and warbled some more. "Your name is BB-8, said the loading droid. "Mine is F32K, but you can call me Fez." The giant was no longer scared, and BB-8 was no longer alone. Fez told BB-8 he was part of a droid ship that was scouting Jakku. His ship was scheduled to leave that afternoon, but Fez was going to miss it because he was stuck in this cell. Scheduled to leave that afternoon. BB-8 was torn. Should he stay on Jakku in case Poe came back? Or should he try to get off the planet in Fez's ship? The map had to be delivered, and soon. But first they had to get out of this trap. As BB-8 looked at a loose panel on the floor, he realized he had a perfect plan. "Excuse me, Mr. Funny Little Lizard Man. We need your help," said Fez. Tito ran to see what was wrong. BB-8 was missing, and there was an opening in the floor. "We were trying to escape, and he fell in that hole," said Fez. Tito climbed into the cell and looked down into the black space. "I don't see him." "Look closer." Tito bent over the hole. "Closer," said Fez. Tito leaned way over the opening and peered in. Beep! With Tito trapped, the two droids were able to escape. "Let's get out of here so I can go home," said Fez. "You can come with me if you want." BB-8 let out a series of chirps and gave an electronic high five. "A mission?" asked Fez. "That sounds important. We'd better get you to the ship.
It's picking us up at the ruins. BB-8 and Fez raced across the desert as fast as they could. The good news is the funny little man is okay, said Fez as he noticed Tito in the distance. The bad news is he's following us. Suddenly, a flock of angry steelpeckers flew up between BB-8 and Fez. BB-8 fled one way, and Fez went the other. The birds didn't know which droid to follow. Hey, over here, cried Fez, trying to get the steelpeckers' attention. Run, BB-8! You have to complete your mission, Fez yelled. I'll save you! BB-8 didn't want to leave his friend, but he had to deliver the map, and Fez was already leading the steelpeckers away. Alone once again, BB-8 continued on his journey. He hoped Fez would be all right. When BB-8 entered Kelvin Ravine, he met a scavenger family. Please, do you know where we could find something to eat? Asked the mother. My children are hungry. Was this another trap? There we go. The children crowded around BB-8. When he saw their thin faces, he knew it wasn't a trick. He remembered the food packets in the wrecked starship where he'd spent the night. But it was in the opposite direction from where he was going. If he hurried, he could get the family to the food and still make it to the droid ship before it took off. If he hurried. BB-8 hurried, and he brought the food to the family. Next, BB-8 found a Hapabor with an injured leg. BB-8 recalled the medical frigate he'd passed that morning. It would have first aid supplies, but going back for them would probably mean missing the droid ship. BB-8 thought for some time, trying to decide what to do. The Hapabor moaned, and BB-8 made up his mind. Tito was never going to catch him on that slow-moving lug-a-beast. BB-8 almost felt sorry for the weird little guy. Almost, but not really. BB-8 finally made it back to the Hapabor with a medical kit. The beast was so happy it licked him and kissed him, which wasn't necessarily a good thing. The droid ship! At last! Only it was preparing to launch. BB-8 worried that he was going to miss the droid ship because he had stopped to help so many people. BB-8 raced for the ramp as it started to close. Then he saw another wonderful sight. Fez! Fez was okay! He had escaped the steelpeckers, and he, too, was running for the droid ship. He waved happily to BB-8, who chirped with joy. They were going to make it off Jakku together after all. But then something terrible happened. Tito appeared, blocking their way. Fez started to panic, but BB-8 quickly formed a plan. He remembered what Tito had said, that BB-8 was more valuable than Fez. He also remembered Fez had saved him from the steelpeckers. BB-8 started to speed away from the ship, and Tito followed BB-8 instead of Fez. I'm trying to get it to where you can see this picture. Where are you going? Yelled Fez. BB-8 beeped in order. Okay, I'll get on the ship, said Fez. Thank you, BB-8. I'll never forget you for helping me. The massive loading droid made it up the ramp just in time. BB-8 felt he had done the right thing in helping Fez, and the hungry family, and the injured Hapabor. But if he had done such good things, then why was this bad thing happening to him? He was so confused. Maybe Poe was wrong. Maybe you don't get what you give. But wait! There's Rey! Or then again, maybe you do. The end. So that is the story of how BB-8 helped all of his friends. And I hope you enjoyed that and that was not too terribly weird to read off a couple of different screens at once. Now we will read a story from the Paddington Treasury. And if you have any requests, as usual, just feel free to leave them in the messages below or send me a private message and I will do my best. The Dragons Love Tacos 2 came a couple of days ago, so we'll be reading that this week, as well as The Day the Crayons Quit and a couple of other books that I'm really, really excited about. So,
I do believe that today is chapter 15, Paddington Cleans Up. Paddington peered through the letterbox at number 32 Windsor Gardens with a look of surprise on his face. In point of fact, he'd been watching out for the postman, but instead of the blue-gray uniform he had hoped to see, Mr. Curry had loomed into view. Mr. Curry looked as if he was in a bad temper. He was never at his best in the morning, but even through the half-open flap, it was plain to see that he was in an even worse mood than usual. He was shaking a rug over the sidewalk, and from the cloud of dust surrounding him, it looked as though he had been cleaning out his grate and had just had a nasty accident with the ashes. The expression on his face boded ill for anyone who happened to come within his range of vision, and it was unfortunate that his gaze alighted on the Browns' front door at the very moment when Paddington opened the letterbox. "Bear!" he bellowed. "How dare you spy on me like that? I've a very good mind to report you." Paddington let go of the flap as if it had been resting in hot coals and gazed at the closed door with a very disappointed air indeed. Apart from an occasional catalogue, he didn't get many letters, but all the same, he always looked forward to seeing the postman arrive, and he felt most aggrieved at being deprived of his morning's treat, especially as he'd been half expecting a postcard from his Aunt Lucy in Peru. Something she'd said when she last written had given him food for thought, and he was anxiously awaiting the next installment. All the same, he knew better than to get on the wrong side of Mr. Curry, so he decided to forget the matter and pay his daily visit to the nearby market in the Portobello Road instead. A few minutes later, having taken his shopping basket on wheels from the cupboard under the stairs, he collected Mrs. Bird's shopping list, made sure the coast was clear, and set out on his journey. Over the years, Paddington's basket on wheels had become a familiar sight in the market, and it was often much admired by passers-by. Paddington took great care of it. He'd several times varnished the basket work, and the wheels were kept so well oiled there was never a squeak. Earlier in the year, Mr. Brown had bought him 2 new tires, so all in all, it still looked good as new. And here is Paddington's shopping trolley. After he'd completed Mrs. Bird's shopping, Paddington called in at the baker's for his morning supply of buns. Then he went on down the Portobello Road in order to visit the antique shop belonging to his friend Mr. Gruber. Paddington liked visiting Mr. Gruber. Apart from selling antiques, Mr. Gruber possessed a large number of books, and although no one knew if he'd actually read them all, it certainly seemed as though he must have, for he was a mine of information on almost every subject one could think of. When he arrived, he found Mr. Gruber sitting on the horsehair sofa just inside his shop, clutching a particularly large volume. "You'll never guess what today's book is about, Mr. Brown," he said, holding it up for Paddington to see. "It's called Diseases of the Cocoa Bean, and there are over 750 pages. Paddington's face grew longer and longer as he listened to Mr. Gruber recite from the long list of things that could happen to a cocoa bean before it actually reached the shops. He always rounded off his morning excursions with a visit to his friend, and Mr. Gruber's contribution to the meeting was a never-ending supply of cocoa, which he kept at the ready on a small stove at the back of the shop. It didn't seem possible that this could ever come to an end. "Perhaps we'd better get some more stocks in, Mr. Gruber," he exclaimed anxiously when there was a gap in the conversation. Mr. Gruber smiled. "I don't think there's any risk of our going short yet a while, Mr. Brown," he replied as he busied himself at the stove. "But I think it does go to show how we tend to take things for granted. We very rarely get something for nothing in this world." Paddington looked slightly relieved at Mr. Gruber's reassuring words. All the same, it was noticeable that he sipped his cocoa even more slowly than usual, and when he'd finished, he carefully wiped round his mug with the remains of a bun in order to make sure he wasn't letting any go to waste. Even after he'd said goodbye to Mr. Gruber, he still had a very thoughtful expression on his face. In fact, his mind was so far away, it wasn't until he rounded a corner leading into Windsor Gardens that he suddenly came back to earth with a bump as he realized that while he'd been in the shop, someone had pinned a note to his shopping basket. It was short and to the point. It said, "Your shopping basket on wheels is in such good condition, it shows you have character, drive, and ambition. This means you are just the kind of person we are looking for. You could earn £100 per week with no more effort than it takes to visit the grocer's. I will be in touch soon with further details." It was written in large capital letters, and it was signed, "Yours truly, a well-wisher." Paddington read the note several times. He could hardly believe his eyes.
Only a moment before, he'd been racking his brains to think up ways of earning some extra money so he could buy Mr. Gruber a tin or two of cocoa. And now, out of nowhere, came this strange offer. It couldn't have happened at a better moment, especially as he'd been tempted to break into the savings which he kept in the secret compartment of his suitcase, and which he held in reserve for special occasions, like birthdays and Christmas. It was hard to believe he could earn so much money simply because he'd kept his shopping basket clean, but before he had a chance to consider the matter, he saw a man in a tan raincoat approach. Oh my goodness! Doggies! Doggies! The fun of live reading. The man was carrying a large cardboard box, which seemed to contain something heavy. Guys! I think the postman will come. Hang on 1 minute. Guys! Oh boy. The man was carrying a large cardboard box, which seemed to contain something heavy, for as he drew near, he rested it on Paddington's basket while he paused in order to mop his brow. Wendy! Shh! Birdie, come here. He looked Paddington up and down for a moment and then held out his hand. Just as I thought, he exclaimed. It's nice when you have a picture of someone in your mind and they turn out exactly as you expected. I'm glad you got my note. If you don't mind my saying so, sir, you should go far. Paddington held out his paw in return. Thank you, Mr. Wishart, he replied, but I don't think I shall go very far this morning. I'm on my way home. He gave the man a hard stare. Although he was much too polite to say so, he couldn't really return the man's compliments. From the tone of the letter, he'd expected someone rather superior, whereas his new acquaintance looked more than a trifle seedy. Catching sight of Paddington's glance, the man hastily pulled his coat sleeves down over his cuffs. I must apologize for my appearance, he said, but I've obtained so many new clients for my vacuum cleaners this morning, I don't know whether I'm coming or going. I haven't even had the time to go home and change. Your vacuum cleaners? Cried Paddington in surprise. The man nodded. Must say, sir, he continued, it's your lucky day. It just so happens that you've caught me with my very last one. Until I take delivery of a new batch later on, of course, he said hastily. Taking a quick glance over his shoulder, he produced a piece of cardboard, which he held up in front of Paddington's eyes for a fleeting moment before returning it to an inside pocket. My card, he announced, just to show that everything's above board. You, too, could become a member of our happy band and make yourself a fortune. Every new member gets free of charge our latest model cleaner and, for today only, a list of do's and don'ts for making your first sale. Now, he slapped the box to emphasize his point, I'm not asking £20 for this very rare privilege. I'm not asking 15. I'm not even asking 10. To you, because I like the look of your face and because I think you're just the sort of bear we're looking for, £5. His voice took on a confidential tone. If I was to tell you the names of some of the people I've sold cleaners to, you probably wouldn't believe me. But I won't bore you with details like that. You're probably asking yourself, what have you to do in order to earn all this money, right? Well, I'll tell you. You sell this cleaner for £10, right? You then buy 2 more cleaners for £5 each and sell them for 20, making £30 in all, right? Then you either keep the money or you buy 6 more cleaners and sell those. If you work hard, you'll make a fortune so fast you won't even have time to get to the bank. Another thing you may be asking yourself, he continued, before Paddington had time to say anything, is why anyone who already has a vacuum cleaner should buy one of ours. He gave the box another slap. Never fear, it's all in here. Ask no questions, tell no lies. With our new cleaner, you can suck up anything. Dirt, mush, ashes, soot, pile it on, anything you like. A flick of the switch and whoosh, it'll disappear in a flash. But, he warned, you'll have to hurry. I have a line of customers waiting round the next corner. Paddington needed no second bidding. It wasn't every day such an offer came his way, and he felt sure he would be able to buy an awful lot of cocoa for £30. Hurrying behind a nearby car, he bent down and opened his suitcase. Thank you very much, said the man, as Paddington counted out £5. Sorry I can't stop go, the work calls. Paddington had been about to inquire where he could pick up his next lot of cleaners, but before he had a chance to open his mouth, the man had disappeared. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. He felt very tempted to take the cleaner straight indoors in order to test it in his bedroom, but he wasn't at all sure Mrs. Bird would approve. In any case, number 32 Windsor Gardens was always kept so spotlessly clean that there didn't seem to be much point. And then, as he reached the end of the road, the matter was suddenly decided for him. Mr. Curry's front door shot open, and the Brown's neighbor emerged once again, carrying a dustpan and brush. He glanced at Paddington. "Are you still spying on me, Bear?" he growled. "I've told you about it once before this morning." "Oh, no, Mr. Curry," said Paddington hastily. "I'm not spying on anyone. I've got a job. I'm selling a new special cleaner." Mr. Curry looked at Paddington uncertainly. "Is this true, Bear?" he demanded. "Oh, yes," said Paddington. "It gets rid of anything. I can give you a free demonstration if you'd like." A sly gleam entered Mr. Curry's eyes. "As a matter of fact," he said, "it does so happen that I'm having a spot of bother this morning. I'm not saying I'll buy anything, mind you, but if you care to clear up the mess, I might consider it." Paddington consulted the handwritten list of instructions, which was pinned to the box. He could see that Mr. Curry was going to come under the heading of customers. Very difficult. "I think," he announced, as the Brown's neighbor helped him up the step with his basket on wheels, "you're going to need what we call the full treatment." Mr. Curry gave a snort. "It had better be good, Bear," he said. "Otherwise, I shall hold you personally responsible." He led the way into his dining room and pointed to a large pile of black stuff in the grate. "I've had a bag full of soot this morning, probably to do with the noise that goes on next door," he said meaningfully. "My cleaner's very good with soot, Mr. Curry," said Paddington eagerly. "Mr. Wisher mentioned it specially." "Good," said Mr. Curry. "I'll just go and finish emptying my dustpan, and then I'll be back to keep an eye on things." As the Brown's neighbor disappeared from view, Paddington hurriedly set to work. Remembering the advice he had been given a short while before, he decided to make certain he gave Mr. Curry a very good demonstration indeed. Grabbing hold of a broom which was standing nearby, he quickly brushed the soot into a large pile in the middle of the hearth. Then he poked the broom up the chimney and waved it around several times. His hopes were speedily realized. There was a rushing sound, and a moment later an even bigger load of soot landed at his feet. Ignoring the black clouds that were beginning to fill the room, Paddington removed the cardboard box from his basket and examined Mrs. Bird's shopping. As he feared, some of it had suffered rather badly under the weight, and he added the remains of some broken custard tarts, several squashed tomatoes, and a number of cracked eggs to the pile. And you can see here, Paddington making a pile. It was while he was stirring it all up with the handle of the broom that Mr. Curry came back into the room. For a moment, he stood as if transfixed. "Bear!" he bellowed. "Bear! What do you think you're doing?" Paddington stood up and gazed at his handiwork. Now that he was viewing it from a distance, he had to admit it was rather worse than he had intended. "It's all part of my demonstration, Mr. Curry," he explained, with more confidence than he felt. "Now," Paddington said, putting on his best salesman's voice as he consulted the instructions again, "I'm sure you will agree that no ordinary cleaner would be any good with this mess." For once in his life, it seemed that Mr. Curry was in complete and utter accord with Paddington. "Have you taken leave of your senses, Bear?" he spluttered. Paddington gave the cardboard box a slap. "No, Mr. Curry," he exclaimed. "Never fear. It's all in here. Ask no questions. I'll tell no lies." Mr. Curry looked as if there were a good many questions he was only too eager to ask, but instead he pointed a trembling finger at the box. "Never fear! It's all in here!" he bellowed. "It had better all be in there. If it's not all in there within 30 seconds, I shall—" Mr. Curry paused for breath, suddenly at a loss for words. Taking advantage of the moment, Paddington opened the lid of the box and withdrew a long piece of wire with a plug on the end. He peered at the baseboard. "Can you tell me where your socket is, Mr. Curry?" he asked. If Paddington had asked the Brown's neighbor for the loan of £1 million, he couldn't have had a more unfavorable reaction. Mr. Curry's face, which had been growing redder and redder with rage, suddenly went a deep shade of purple as he gazed at the object in Paddington's paw. "My socket!" he roared. "My socket! I haven't any sockets, Bear! I don't even have electricity! I use gas!" Paddington's jaw dropped, and the plug slipped from his paw and fell unheeded to the floor as he gazed at the Brown's neighbor. If Mr. Curry's face had gone a deep shade of purple, Paddington's, or the little that could be seen of it beneath his fur, was as white as a sheet. He wasn't sure what happened next. He remembered Mr. Curry picking up the cardboard box as if he was about to hurl it through the window, but he didn't wait to see any more. He dashed out through the front door and back into number 32 Windsor Gardens as if his very life depended on it. And here he is doing just that. To his surprise, the door was already open, but it wasn't until he cannoned into Mr. Gruber that he discovered the reason why. His friend was deep in conversation with the other members of the family. For some reason, they seemed even more pleased to see him than he was to see them. "There you are!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "Thank goodness," Mrs. Brown said thankfully. "Are you all right?" chorused Jonathan and Judy. "I think so," said Paddington, peering over his shoulder as he hastily closed the door behind him. "No one's tried to sell you a vacuum cleaner?" said Mrs. Bird. Paddington stared at the Browns' housekeeper in amazement. It really was uncanny the way Mrs. Bird knew about things. "There have been some going-ons down at the market this morning, Mr. Brown," broke in Mr. Gruber. "That's why I popped in. Someone's been selling dud vacuum cleaners, and when I heard you had been seen talking to him, I began to get worried." "When you were back so late, we thought something might have happened to you," said Mrs. Brown. "Well," said Paddington vaguely, "I think it has." Paddington launched into his explanations. It was a bit difficult, partly because he wasn't too sure how to put some of it into words, but also because there was a good deal of noise going on outside. Shouts and bangs and the sound of a loud argument followed a moment or so later by the roar of a car driving away. "Fancy trying to take advantage of someone like that," said Mrs. Bird grimly when Paddington had finished. "He seemed like quite a nice man, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I didn't mean the vacuum cleaner salesman," said Mrs. Bird. "At least he gave you something for your money, even if it didn't work. I meant Mr. Curry. He's always after something for nothing." "He's too mean to get his chimney swept for a start," said Judy. "And I bet he's still waiting to see if electricity catches on before he changes over," agreed Jonathan. They broke off as the telephone started to ring, and Mrs. Bird hurried across the hall to answer it. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Really? Yes, of course. Well, we'll do our best," she added after a while. "But it may not be for some time. Probably later on this morning." The others grew more and more mystified as they listened to their end of the conversation. "What on earth was that all about?" asked Mrs. Brown as her housekeeper replaced the receiver. "It seems," said Mrs. Bird gravely, "that the police think they might have caught the man who's been selling the dud vacuum cleaners. They want someone to go down and identify him." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't really like the idea of Paddington being involved in things like that." "Who said anything about Paddington?" asked Mrs. Bird innocently. "Anyway, I suggest we all have a nice hot drink before we do anything else. There's no point in rushing things." The others exchanged glances as they followed Mrs. Bird into the kitchen. She could be very infuriating at times, but the Browns' housekeeper refused to be drawn, and it wasn't until they were all settled round the kitchen table with their second lot of 11Cs that she brought the matter up again. "It seems," she mused, "that the man they arrested was caught right outside our house. He was carrying a cleaner at the time. He said his name was Murray, or Hurry, or something like that. Anyway, he insists we know him." "Crumbs!" exclaimed Jonathan as the light began to dawn. "Don't say they picked on Mr. Curry by mistake." "I bet that's what all the noise was about just now," said Judy. "I bet he was coming round here to complain." "Which is why," said Mrs. Bird, when all the excitement had died down, "I really think it might be better if Paddington doesn't go down to the police station. It might be rubbing salt into the wound." "I quite agree," said Mr. Gruber. "In fact, while you're gone, perhaps young Mr. Brown and I can go next door and clean up some of the mess." "We'll help too," said Jonathan and Judy eagerly. All eyes turned to Paddington, who was savoring his drink with even more relish than usual. What with Mr. Gruber's book on diseases and the disastrous events in Mr. Curry's house, he'd almost begun to wonder if he would ever have any 11Cs again. "I think," he announced as he clasped the mug firmly between his paws, "I shall never take any cocoa for granted again." And that is the end. So tomorrow we will start an entirely new section called A Case of Mistaken Identity. And I think tomorrow we will read Dragons Love Tacos 2 at around noon as well. So I hope you enjoyed the stories today. I certainly did. Have a wonderful day, a good start to your week, and try and do something fun in the lovely weather outside. I will see you tomorrow. Bye!